To the cloud. There we are.
All right, perfect. So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Lady Gelleia le Vinter with the SCA. I come from the Barony of Rising Waters, and I wanted to put this on to discuss some of the ingredients that could be growing in your backyard that are edible and have a long history with human population, really, and how we've over the last couple hundred years changed our view from this is a plant that's really worth keeping and we've intentionally harvested to this is now something that we consider a weed and should be eradicated. So without further ado, I want to let you know that all of my research has been based in rising waters. Thanks to COVID, I've been exploring my backyard quite extensively. This is going to cover growing months between late March through to, now it says the first frost, but realistically, that's because I intend on continue foraging, but it's up to present. So it'll be, till the end of August, more realistically. So what I wanted to cover were weeds that are edible, ways to consume them fresh, how to preserve a couple of them, along with sharing some of the recipes that I've sort of developed with all the ingredients, since it's one thing to pick it up and eat it, that's all great. But ultimately, if you can make something into it, you're going to use it much more likely. So the first one that I found in the yard was garlic mustard. You can find it in the shade, and it's actually an invasive plant. So if you see it in your yard and you're pulling it up, by all means, you're helping yourself by eating this one. It can outgrow, or it can eradicate local vegetation because it kills off the natural fungi in the soils that it grows around. So it takes over really strong, and then to get rid of it, you're pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling to get rid of it. So I find the best time to eat garlic mustard is before it bolts. So bolting, if you're not familiar with the term, just means that it's gone up to flower and is going to be seeding soon. So if you can catch the garlic mustard before then, you're also helping to reduce the spread of the seeds because you're not going to let them, hit the ground and continue to grow. So there's actually like a 2-year cycle. So the top photo is of a first-year plant. You'll notice that the leaves are more round and the edges are kind of like a soft curly shape, I find. Second year, it's going to come up and it has more of a teardrop shape with more defined points. So if you're looking for either of them, those are both the same plant. It's just 1 year versus year 2. Culinary uses, I use it a lot in pesto. Can be used as a garlic substitute as well in cooked foods. But personally, I find it to be you need a lot of the garlic mustard to bring out a true garlic flavor if you're doing it in like a roasted potato, for example. So making it into a pesto, I find you get the best bang for your buck. Another interesting point about the garlic mustard, it actually has traces of cyanide like other veggies of the Brassicaceae family, such as your broccoli, cabbage, mustards, and stuff like that. But it's not at a harmful level to intake, so this is rather safe plant to eat. But just, kind of a fun fact, something to know about this one. So here's our first recipe. Because we are going to be recording this, I wasn't going to read through each of the recipes that are posted, but if people are interested, either take snippets or once the recording is posted to YouTube, feel free to go back and check it out as a reference. Beyond having the garlic mustard pesto as a dip for vegetables, I found it actually went really good on steak or chicken once it was done on the barbecue. Or if you're making like an egg salad sandwich, spread some of this on one half of the toast and then put it together. It tastes rather nice. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they've worked with garlic mustard themselves before?
Does the garlic mustard blend well with any other green herbs, or will you be getting to that later?
I haven't really done too much blending with other herbs, but I don't see why you couldn't. Just off the top of my head, I might pair it with some oregano if I wanted to make a more dynamic pesto for it, personally.
Hey, do you know what?
Hello.
Do you know what region it originate? Do you know where it originates from and what kind of plants it usually competes with?
To be honest, I remember reading it came from Europe, but I can't remember exactly where, and I don't remember exactly how far back it goes. From what I found, it looks like it came over during migration periods, and then it just really took well to being here. It was originally cultivated intentionally, but then here it just sort of became a weed because it was so invasive. But I don't know exactly what kind of plants it goes after. I personally found it growing side by side, like dandelions and thistles, raspberries. So my property is fairly grown in areas. So to say it's competing, I don't know what it would be competing with on my property, but other environments, it might be fighting something else.
In my yard, it seems to not like grass or clover. So it kind of goes with what you were saying.
Yeah, and that's true. Like I don't have any grass or clover in that area, but it's also growing under very large pine trees where you're not going to see grass or clover really growing under that environment.
That's
And,
true.
yeah. All right, so I'll go into the next one. Garlic scapes. So this is not technically a foraged ingredient. I mean, it could be if you've got wild garlic growing in your property. But if you are planting it in the garden, the garlic scape is essentially the garlic flower before it has a chance to bloom. So it creates this really nice, like giant curly Q. And if you harvest that before it gets too woody and before it blooms, you're helping the plant because it's going to feed the nutrients back into the bulb and help make the bulb bigger. But you can use these. You don't have to just throw them out. So I like to break them off when they're still tender, kind of using the same trick I used for asparagus, where you know when to break it off because there's a natural woodier part to it compared to the rest of the plant, so it snaps off really easily. For culinary uses, you can use this as almost a one-to-one substitute for regular chopped garlic, I find. They are rather potent. But I have two ways of preserving them in case if you've got way more garlic scapes than you can hope to eat before they start to go bad. So one of those is garlic salt, which is ridiculously simple. I just got a container of a container of sea salt in a mason jar. So I sprinkled some of that in the bottom, and then I finally chopped up all my scapes, put a layer of garlic scape, put more salt, and did that until I was out of garlic scapes. I don't recommend using the regular table salt though, because it doesn't taste nearly as good as the sea salt. And if you notice that there's still quite a bit of liquid the next day because the moisture is leaving the garlic scapes, by all means, top it up with more garlic salt. It's not gonna, or just regular sea salt, and then leave it in the cupboard. I've had mine going since April. I've only used a little bit of it, and I have to say the taste is certainly strong. So use it sparingly, however you choose to use it. We like to use, just cucumbers and tomato slices for lunch sometimes, and we'll sprinkle a little bit of salt and pepper. I've switched over to using this garlic salt, and I use a fraction of what I would use for regular table salt, just because the garlic, if you get a little bit of that garlic scape in your mouth after it's been sitting for a bit in the salt, it packs a punch. Another way to put it away is garlic oil. So I cut mine into 3-inch chunks, and then I sliced them horizontally. So I laid it on the cutting board and then kind of ran a knife through in between the two. Put them in a small jar again, covered it with olive oil, and I popped that in the fridge just to keep it from going off on me. That I found really good in salad dressings. It doesn't hold up as well to being cooked, I think the high heat temperatures would kind of evaporate the essential oils from the garlic, and then it just turns back into regular olive oil. Does anybody have any experiences using garlic scape, or do you save them? Do you toss them?
I had got garlic scapes from my produce person, and a internet recipe led me astray, and I made a pesto that the children said tasted like wasabi. So
Ooh.
really the one-to-one garlic tip is probably bang on, because this said 4 cups of spinach, 1 cup of garlic scapes, and I only put in a 1/4 cup, and it was still tasted like wasabi. So
Yeah.
really use sparingly, and you can always add more later. But I use it as an additive to soups now, because it's already made. Just a spoonful in a like an 8-liter pot.
Wow.
That's
Yeah,
very strong.
I've had
yeah,
no problems with
that's
scapes. I've chopped them up and pan fried them. I throw them into soups and everything, and I'd put in a good 1/4 cup of stuff and have never really had problems with them.
No, these ones must have been very strong, because the children are like, this tastes like wasabi, and they weren't wrong.
wow. Yeah, across them tasting like wasabi, but I also find I tend to cook with quite a bit of garlic in my household. So yeah, that could be personal preference. Could also be that they were maybe a little bit older, so were they woody when you used them, or was they still fairly tender?
Very tender, yeah.
Oh,
Well, I
wow.
blended them into a pesto, so I couldn't tell you for sure.
Pesto, all the way,
Pesto all the way.
especially on potatoes.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Oh,
Roasted
that sounds
potatoes with
delish.
garlic scape pesto. Yum, yum.
Mm. All right, this one I have to say, plantain, I have fallen head over heels for it.
Oh,
Yes, plantain is often found in grassy areas. It's a very common weed in at least Southern Ontario. I haven't lived anywhere else the rest of my life, so I can't really comment on other places. I find it's very versatile, and in addition to being something that you can eat, it's also a very diverse first aid treatment for ailments such as mild burns, scrapes, insect bites, and it acts as a mild laxative and can help with indigestion. So this plant is definitely your friend. In the early spring, when the leaves are small, kind of like in the upper photo, you can use it in salads, no problem. Or if you get an insect bite, I honestly just pick up a leaf or two, chew it up, make a poultice out of it, slap that on the bug bite, and within 5 minutes, I don't have any more itch. And I have to tell you, I am the kind of person who itches and scratches at everything until I make a mess out of myself. So for me to find something that truly works as an anti-bug bite, it's my new best friend. You can continue to use these plants throughout the summertime. Once they get a little bit more mature, you may see a little bit of red coming in the main stem or onto the back side. They do get tougher, especially if you mow over them. I noticed that they tend to hardy up versus if you leave them alone in the shade or shaded areas that are not as disturbed, they'll stay a bit more tender for longer. Once they're a bit bigger, they're better to use as an alternative to spinach in some of your cooking. And so, leading to cooking, I recently made up a shrimp stir fry with it. So I went outside, grabbed several handfuls of the mature plantain leaves. I chopped it up with some garlic, onion, ginger, and had some popcorn shrimp in the freezer. And I cooked the shrimp separately and made up the green stir fry in one pan. And I let it go until it was nice and crispy just because of preference. The plantain does have a bitter flavor as it gets more mature, but it worked really well with the ginger in this and packs quite a bunch of flavor. So,
Is the flavor close to, say, a cabbage, or?
No, I wouldn't say cabbage. I would say it's, what's a bitter green? Agnes, you might be able to answer this one. There's definitely a green vegetable that I don't like because it's bitter and I can't stand it. Usually, or at least I didn't for a long time. Can you remember what that is?
She says endive in the chat.
Possibly?
Yeah, that's a bitter green. Well, it can be a
Yeah.
bitter green. Yeah.
Radicchio is another one, but that one's pretty bitter.
Yeah.
That's the red-leaved one.
Oh, that's a usually salad mix, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't quite taste like that either. I want to say
I'll
like
have to try it. I'll have to try it.
yeah. Like the young ones don't taste very bitter to me, but after you cook up the more mature ones, they've definitely got like a good kick to them. But the ginger also has a very strong flavor, and between the two, I found it mellowed each other out, so it worked well. Has anybody else adventured in eating plantain by chance?
I haven't eaten it, but when I was still living out in Calgary, a coworker of mine and he is a Indigenous heritage, and who was taught by his grandfather, went on like a foraging walk together. It's one of the pathways, and he was pointing out some of the stuff, and he pointed out plantain, and he said that indigenously, at least in that area, it was used like you said with the poultice, and they're actually, but also it was used to help stop bleeding. In that if you put it on one way, the veins will actually help stop the bleeding of like minor cuts. And if this is another how widespread it is. If I remember, I recall seeing it used again as medicinally in the Good Houseway book from England, which is a late period kind of how-to book, kind of a gentleman esquire type wrote. So again, the same similar vein. You're using it as a poultice with several other herbs to put it on wounds, or like you said, like a bug bite or something.
Yeah. Do you remember how your friend was applying it to stop bleeding? Was it like a whole leaf, or was it also crushed?
The whole leaf, because I think
Interesting.
it was about how the veins in the plant were placed, that it would actually wick up blood away from the wound, and then if I remember correctly, what it sounded like is they would make a different poultice and put it on the wound, then put the leaf over, and between the combination, it would actually help stop bleeding, or because it was drawing everything away from the actual wound itself. And then they would actually, when everything was stopped bleeding, they would actually put a different on with the reverse side, just to actually help cover the wound.
Huh. That's certainly good knowledge. I'm gonna have to experiment with that a little bit and maybe do a little bit of research. Yeah, I could certainly use that. I do quite a bit of yard work, and there's often times I come in and husband's going, "What did you do? Why are you bleeding? I'm bleeding." Yes, again.
But I just remember this was some years ago, and I'm pretty sure that's how he was describing how it was used. But it was definitely used for wound care along with other herbs. And I've seen between him and, like I said, in England, late 1500s, it was as early as that, it was understood to be a medicinal herb.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. All right, so another one. In May, we have the maple blossom. And stand to reason that you would find a maple blossom on a maple tree. Um, yeah, I was like, how do I not be super sarcastic? Gonna do it. So best time to pick. I found that these were actually a really narrow window for picking. And depending on if it's a red maple or a sugar maple, they look a little bit different. So I grabbed a couple of photos online to show. And it was really only like 2 or 3 day window that I noticed them. And I'd never tried these before, but I was looking online for other like Southern Ontario foraging ideas. And this one came up and it piqued my interest because I absolutely love maple. I could not get enough of it. So I thought, okay, let's give this maple blossom a try. And I found a beignets recipe that I intended on trying, which basically just, you know, harvest the maple blossom, batter her up and fry her in a pan. And I'm like, okay, well, before I get to all that involved stuff, I'm going to just try it and see what it's like on its own. I would have thought there might have been a little bit of, you know, sweetness for, you know, this, the pollen coming through and that kind of thing. No, I found these just tasted like green. If the color green could have a taste, this is it. I did not like it at all, but I thought I would put it in here anyways to show not every forage is a win. It could be up somebody else's alley, but after tasting it, I was like, this is not even worth the time of day for me to batter it up, fry it in a pan, and all that other stuff. You know what? The tree can keep it. Another one that I found in May, though, are spruce tips. So my property actually has a perimeter of, I would say, over 100-foot tall spruce trees. And they were in bloom for quite a while, and different trees came into bloom at different weeks. So it was interesting. I actually got a fairly long harvesting cycle out of spruce tips. And I don't know if anybody else struggles with this, but, you know, coniferous trees I find are sometimes difficult to identify between one another. Pine versus spruce versus, you know, whatever, all the other ones that are out there. So as a reminder to myself, I just made sure to look for the ones that had growth all the way around the branch for the pine or for the spruce tips. Pine apparently seemed to be more like left and right of a branch as opposed to all the way around. If somebody else has a better tip, I'd love to hear it. But for harvesting, I waited until they were a couple of inches long. So in the lower photo, you can see that there's like this papery covering, and that's going to pop off first. And then you're going to get these little rinky-dink guys. And I mean, honestly, you could harvest them if you wanted to, but you might as well just wait until they're a little bit bigger and get more bang for your buck. The only suggestion I have is making sure that when you're pulling it off, that the stem it's growing on is still green, just like the needles, and it hasn't turned woody, because otherwise you'd have to like pull them all off. So when I got them this young, I could just chop them all up and it was all good. As a rule of thumb for foraging, and this should be said kind of just broad stroke across the spectrum, avoid overpicking. Because usually when you're harvesting something, now this is exception to the garlic mustard, harvest that until your heart's content. But everything else, try and be a little bit conservative. Nature still needs what it's growing to. So for the spruce tips, in the top photo, you'll see that it's common that there'll be 3, maybe 4 offshoots on a branch. Really avoid grabbing this center one because that's going to help grow the length of the whole tree branch. So if you pull that off, you're not going to get any growth for the year. In a cluster of 5, I would only grab 1. So you know, take 1, leave 4. If you're in an area trying to pick like on average 1 for every 10 that you see growing, you're going to be safe. So for the flavor of these, I was actually amazed at how citrusy they were. I didn't get a pine taste. I didn't get cedar or any of that kind of taste. Like I know I'm listing different trees, but they tasted really citrusy. So they can be pickled, added to sauces, or eaten fresh. I've come up with a Canadian tzatziki recipe because of this. Yeah, it's great. So if you've ever made tzatziki before, it's usually like cucumber and yogurt strained, and then lemon juice, garlic, olive oil, and a little bit of salt. Well, I really dumbed it down and I pulled out the lemon entirely and I used spruce tips instead. So this is kind of just my recipe that I use normally, and then just swapped out the spruce tips for lemon juice. Oh, sorry, brain fart. And I notice here it says 2/3 of a tablespoon of chopped young spruce tips. Yeah, I need to put a dash. It's 2 to 3 tablespoons, so I will fix that post video. And then souvlaki goes really well with it, or dip for fresh vegetables. That's usually how I end up consuming it. If hubby doesn't get to it first, I turn around and he eats it all because it's very good.
Hey, is this a
Hello.
good time for a question?
Of course it is.
So you mentioned pickling. I've been experimenting with pickling a little bit this year, with, I would say, mixed success. What do you have you had a chance to try them pickled? And if so, do you have a good brining recipe?
To be entirely honest, I saw a couple of recipes for pickling. I would be happy to pass it along if you'd like to give it a try. I did not get into pickling this year for the reason that I didn't really want to get into canning either, and I didn't want to deal with the mess of like all the hot pots and the hot glass jars and everything else. So I took this season and went to the dehydrating spectrum of preserving. But if you are interested, I can certainly send you a link off the chat with what looked like a very promising pickling recipe for these if you're interested.
Okay. Yeah, no rush, but I would appreciate that later. Yeah.
Yeah, not a problem. Is this Nate speaking? I feel like I have to play the guessing game because I don't know what I've
Yep,
clicked.
this is Nat.
Nat? Okay.
Is it, you mentioned that they have a citrusy taste. I'm wondering if that's because got to do with the vitamin C in them. There's like the same friend of mine, when we were doing our walk, he mentioned that if you ever get lost in the woods and need a source of vitamin C, use either pine tips or the sap, because that will they've got enough that has enough vitamin C in it to prevent scurvy.
It very well could be. To be entirely honest, I didn't look too deeply into the natural benefits because I started looking them up for a bunch of things, and just like any other topic, you start looking at things and then it all just turns into a big mushy blur. I don't remember what is good for what, but I know they taste great. I was surprised at how good these things taste.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm going to jump in with a comment.
Sure.
This is Agnes speaking. I was on an Indigenous webinar earlier this summer, and they were talking about COVID and Indigenous medicines for boosting immunity and that kind of thing. The one thing that they cautioned for people who are learning these kinds of things new is that be very careful that you have the correct trees that you're harvesting from. Juniper, an indigenous medicine, is a very strong medicine. And you might find that you're cleaning yourself real good inside and out if you eat too much of that. So
yeah,
some of the evergreens you have to be careful of. Now, they didn't mention spruce as being a problem if you eat too much, like if you just have tzatziki 3 nights in a row. But just be careful that you've identified the trees right. And with any of these foraging things, try a little bit to start and see how your own body reacts, because everybody might have different sensitivities to different things.
Yeah, and that was something I was going to have in my concluding notes too. Is, you know, I am not a doctor. I am just somebody who likes to eat, and I will eat a lot of different things because why not? So yeah, that's a really good point. Everybody needs to be aware of how their own bodies are going to react to these things. And depending on how in depth you go, or maybe not in depth, but depending on the variety of things you decide to forage, if you are on medications, it's highly recommended to speak to your doctor before you get too engrossed in eating something. It could react with medicines from what I've seen. There's a lot of cautions about that. I am not currently on any medications. I have not actually had any adverse effects from any of the things I'm going to be presenting or have already presented in tonight's discussion. But yes, in addition to being careful about not over-harvesting, pay attention to your own body too. If something makes you feel funny, don't keep eating it.
That's good advice in general.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Black Cap Raspberries. These apparently did really well this year in a lot of parts of Ontario. The reason I say that is because I've joined a couple of Facebook groups around foraging in Ontario. And in July, it felt like every third post was somebody going, I found these berries and I picked a whole bunch of them. Are these black caps? And they are on the sides of the roads. They're in the bush. They're in my yard. Yes, they are edible. They are rather tart, very seedy, and our patches are particularly growing underneath all the really tall spruce trees. Is that the only place they grow? I doubt it. Is it where I'm finding mine? Yes. So that's where to find it just says under trees. Best time to pick, late May into mid-July. So I noticed that I was starting to see the small fruits coming in, and I kept an eye on them pretty much every day. They grow in clusters of 5 or 6, kind of just like on the right side of the photo here. And oftentimes the center berry was the one ripened first, and then the ones around the outside would ripen over the next couple of days in pairs or a couple at a time. And I think in the patch that I had, I was able to pick about 3 quarts full. So I went to the market, got strawberries, had all the plastic green quart or pint baskets, and I filled at least 3 of those. And that was just from an area that was maybe 10 feet by 4 feet, you know, in size, and got a pretty good harvest out of them. And the birds love them too. So I had to monitor these pretty much daily if I wanted them, because otherwise the squirrels and the jays and the robins and everybody else who I share this property with wanted them too. I personally really love raspberries, but can never stomach spending like $5 on a half pint at the grocery store of the nice big showy red ones. So for me to find that I was living on a property with wild raspberries was so happy. I turned these into a homemade Jolly Rancher candy by accident. I will get into that anecdote in a minute. But another thing that, you know, is commonly made is jam. These guys have a lot of pectin in them, and I forgot about that. So I tried making a fruit leather out of them and tried to squish it through my strainer, and had a clogged strainer very quickly and went, what's going on? Why isn't it going through? Realized that my berries had turned gelatinous before I'd finished straining them. So I screw it, put it on toast, and ate them anyway. So it never became jam.
Now, I'm wondering if you found them tart because they were growing under the spruce. It's Marina speaking. Because I grew up eating these. I've been picking them since I was 3 years of age and able to pick the low branches, because the rest of the family picked the high branches. And we had, you know, we were picking them from the ditches and everything, so they're always out in bright sun. And the ones that were in the shade of the walnut trees and those areas were always plumper and juicier because they got more moisture. And we've always found them sweet because we use them on ice cream, would mash them up and use them on ice cream as well. Not as a sauce, but just as fresh berries.
Mm.
So I'm wondering if the soil had something to do with that tartness for you.
It very well could be from, you know, the pine needles that kind of acted as an insulator to keeping more moisture in the ground, to the fact that the area that they're growing in is also very rocky, I noticed. There's a lot of limestone in that part of the property as well. So there could be a number of factors why I found these ones tart. Sweet, yeah. Tart, yeah. If I was to compare it to a grocery store one, and like those ones taste very mild in comparison to the wild ones. So yeah, it could be just where they were growing.
Well, and spruces are highly acidic. That's a very acidic ground that they're growing in there. And these things will grow all over the place. They do like crap ground to grow in as well.
Oh, good. Okay, well, that's good to know. I noticed that they were really long canes as well. So I've been spending pretty much the rest of the summer trying to clear out the second and third year growth that have kind of basically just died off. There's nothing coming off of them, and they're just a nasty bunch of prickles to walk into. So that hopefully next spring I have just the primo canes that are going to be bearing the fruit, and then whatever new growth comes up, so I can start managing the plot a little bit better. Because these canes did get really tall and had bent back over and sort of rooted themselves on the other end and created an arch, which when you're trying to pick berries in between all of that, I had a lot of them, you know, pull hair, pull skin, and everything else. So hopefully I can get a little bit less of a fight next year because of all the pruning.
Yeah, they're very frisky plants. They like to grab.
Yeah. So the Jolly Rancher candy, this was a complete fluke and a half. So I picked up a dehydrator this year, and I've been having a load of fun with it. And I thought, okay, well, I'm gonna try and make like a raspberry and watermelon fruit leather. So I started off by making a compote with the raspberries, and I tried mash them all up, and I realized, okay, this is where the straining problem came up. I wasn't getting a whole lot out of it, so I thought, okay, maybe if I can just have them at least squashed and then mixed with the juice and then thinned out a little bit with the watermelon juice, I should be okay. But I guess I didn't have the berries squished enough, so there was some that were bigger chunks than others, and then some of the juice kind of pooled to one side of my dehydrator tray. So it's like, if anybody has ever done fruit leathers before, you might be familiar with this, but if you haven't, my dehydrator comes with like a silicone tray that you can put on top of the mesh trays that you usually use for dehydrating, and then that's how you can put like a liquidy substance or a puree on it, and it will dry into a fruit leather, theoretically. After about 51 hours of drying and this stuff still being sticky, I gave up and I pulled it out, and I thought, you know what, I'm not letting this go to the waste. I had chunks of it where the berries were still not quite dry, but they were hard enough to pull off in chunks. And the juice was still like tar almost at this point. Like it got really sticky. And then in other spots, the juice was really thin and it cracked and it was awful. But I refused to throw it out. I was stubborn, as always. And I made a big mess of the counter, pulled it all off with my hands, and shoved it in a Tupperware and said, you know what, I'll deal with you tomorrow. Threw it in the fridge, woke up the next morning, and it had cooled off, and I think all the sugar crystals hardened, and it turned it into a really hard lump. But man, did that stuff taste good. Is this a real recipe?
Oh, man.
It was a happy fluke. But I still have it in my fridge from, a couple of months ago. It's still doing well, hasn't gone moldy, hasn't gone soft, nothing like that. But it's pretty close to a Jolly Rancher in case if anybody wants to try and replicate it for whatever reason.
I wonder if you can try to reconstitute it as some sort of like raspberry sweetener, or maybe like a tea or something.
Maybe. Like just put in a bit of hot water and see if it'll kind of dissolve.
I don't know, just a thought.
I've been enjoying it just the way it is.
That's fair.
I don't know if I'm willing to try it again because, like I said, this was like 51 hours of me dehydrating. And, you know, when I first started the dehydrating stuff, I was amazed that, like, mint, which is a fairly big leaf, but I didn't expect it to take 24 hours to dry, does. And I'm like, okay, this is mushy berries. Of course, this is going to take longer. But I'd noticed that the color had changed from like a bright red to like a dark purple almost. So I was almost concerned that the heat in my dehydrator was too high and that it was more cooking the sugars rather than dehydrating it, which I think also led to the hardening and the candy aspect next day. But it was good anyways. Yeah, purslane. So I heard somebody giggle. Somebody knows what this one is, eh?
Yeah.
So this one has a look-alike, and it's called spurge. So I want to just take a minute and talk about that. A lot of the other plants that I'm bringing up do not have look-alikes that are harmful, at least to the best of my knowledge. This is one that will. I didn't include a picture of spurge because trying to get Google images to differentiate between purslane and spurge was really difficult. Purslane is pretty mucusy in terms of, like, if you grab a leaf and you squish it, it's going to feel like aloe vera. It usually likes open ground. I find it's usually in my tomato plant area, but I've also seen it kind of like on little rocky areas under the drain spouts, or you know, coming up between concrete. Like, it seems to kind of grow wherever it's got sun. Spurge also grows in open ground areas, but it's not as beefy of a stem. The leaves are significantly smaller, and the quickest way to identify the difference between purslane and spurge, if you break a purslane stem, it should be clear. You shouldn't have any like color to the broken stem. If you break spurge, it will have white milk coming out of it, and that's toxic. So please be careful if you're pulling this one and you're not 100% confident on what it is. Purslane, as you can see, has like a teardrop shape for the green leaves, and the stems start off green when they're young, and then as they get a bit older, they take on this reddish hue, what I've seen. The first signs that I saw them were in like June. The leaves get bigger in July, and I've continued to see it, and it's continuing to grow around here. And it's really good in salads. I haven't seen any uses of it being cooked. But honestly, I love the taste of it. So if I'm just walking around, I'll just grab a couple handfuls of this and I'll just snack on it like while I'm working. I don't need a reason to eat it. It's just good. I know salads might not really merit having a recipe per se, but I thought I would share a couple of salad recipes that I've kind of been making as staples in our place. Just with the gardens that I've got here, it's worked out really well. So in the early summer, I was doing a bed of mixed greens with a lot of mint, oregano, chives, and parsley, and some marigold petals tossed on top just for a pop of color. And then in the later part of the summer, I was doing the bed of mixed greens, beet tops, purslane, a fresh peach that I've cubed up, young beetroot, cherry tomatoes, and feta cheese. So other than feta cheese and a peach, everything else were things that I've got growing in my garden. So this is a version of garden salads.
Alaise de
Does anybody
Poitiers.
else?
Alaise de Poitiers entered pickled purslane in Kingdom A&S when it was held in Ottawa a few years ago. And Siglinda is currently, she's posting about it in her blog and on Facebook. She has been cooking up many medieval Turkish and Persian recipes that call for purslane. So she's been experimenting with that this summer. So she's done, what, 3 or 4 different recipes, Persian recipes lately.
Ooh, I should try and find some of those writings. That would be interesting.
So it's Diane Harper on Facebook, and she has a WordPress blog called, Michelle, what is it called? Siglinda's?
Siglin's Arts.
Can I get a spelling of that, please?
I'm gonna look up the journal and I will put it into the chat window.
Okay. Thank you so
that
much.
way you don't have to be distracted.
Yay. I'm trying to keep my notes as minimal as possible, but I'm an avid note taker, so part of me is like, just make a quick note. It's okay. I can make a quick note. Just don't sit there and scribble everything, because it is being recorded. I can go back to it later. Does anybody else have any comments on, different salad toppings or uses of purslane and that kind of thing?
I found that it had a texture in your mouth like okra, and I'm not fond of that gelatinous effect. It might be something I can get used to. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of those Turkish recipes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly does take a little bit of getting used to, and I found that if I put too much of it in my salads, I did notice that it kind of made my stomach feel not upset, but I don't know how to say it without being gross, but if you've ever been sick and you're producing a lot of mucus and you just keep, hucking it back, if you've ever noticed that your stomach kind of feels off with all of that in it, it's kind of similar if you eat way too much purslane. So the purslane is delicious, but I also have that in small amounts because of its mucousy texture, if that makes sense. All right, so one of the last ingredients, if not the last, I can't quite remember, is chicory. So this stuff grows on the side of the road in the ditches where it's gravelly, where it seems like there's probably no nutrients. I don't know how this stuff grows, but it loves it there. I've also seen it on the edges of farmers' fields. Not so much into the grassy areas, so it really likes the rocky environment. I found that the best time to pick it was in July when it was in bloom, mostly because I have a hard time identifying it when there are no flowers, because it usually gets mowed over and then it looks very similar to dandelion leaves at the ground level. But it is a well-known coffee substitute. If you are going to go harvest some of this, I recommend that you don't pull it right from the side of the road, because it could have pollutants from vehicles driving by it, like exhaust fumes and that kind of thing. You don't really want to be intaking that. So if you go for a hike and you see some kind of away from trafficked areas, that's probably better to pull. Also, you're probably going to need a shovel. The roots on these suckers are like a dandelion, stubborn and deep. I tried pulling it out by hand and just about knocked me on my butt. It didn't work out very well. So I went back home, grabbed a shovel, spooked my neighbors because I was digging a hole in the park next door with nobody else around. So I got somebody else. I didn't really care. So the chicory flower has the bright blue flowers. My screen right now is showing them as a bit of a purple. I don't know if that's being represented to everybody else, but they are a very crystal clear blue flower. The stalks are fairly woody. They're hardy. The base leaves do look like a dandelion leaf. And they can grow, I've seen them like 3 feet tall if they get really out of control. Yeah.
If you're identifying by blooms, they bloom in the morning, and close up tight later in the day. So they look like they're no longer blooming now, but they bloom in the mornings.
And there's also white chicory.
Oh, I've never seen white chicory.
You can see it in the ditches in around the Port Hope area where I grew up. We had the blue and we had the white.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I've only ever seen the blue ones. I find that they like to grow near Queen Anne's lace by the looks of it too. At least around here, they're kind of one plant next to each other.
You might also want, if you're harvesting near farmers' fields, to make sure that they're fields that haven't been treated with pesticides. Yeah, because the runoff from a field might contaminate the wild plants too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So
A
when I was
real
looking,
nice wild place is the best place to get those.
yeah, and it can certainly seem like a bit of a challenge, especially with how well they grow on the side of the road. It can be really tempting to be like, oh, look, there's like a great patch of this stuff. It'll be great, but leave it. Just leave it. Find a different patch. This is where I got lucky, and we've got kind of an old school across the road from us that's no longer in use, but it's got a big lawn and it's mowed, but right near the chain link fence of the big area that's in use, the chicory was growing. So I'm like, okay, I know this is going to be fine because there's, it's far enough away from the road. There's not a lot of traffic. It's not on the edge of a field, so there's no runoff issues. But yeah, you might see a lot of this. Just be careful about what you decide to harvest. So coffee substitute, it has no caffeine in it. It's very bitter when brewed, and I liken it to toasted marshmallows. I've had somebody else tell me that it tasted like burnt sponge toffee as well. So it has like a sweet note to it, but it's very bitter as well. What did I have here? So when I found I was harvesting it, I just took the whole plant as best as I could, and then I just took the roots off when I was ready to go home. Gave them a really good scrub underwater, made sure all the dirt was off, then I chopped them up, and I put them in the oven, roasted them for 10-15 minutes, let them cool off, and then put them in my coffee blender, and then I made it up like a tea, just because I didn't really feel like putting it through my coffee pot, although that is another way you could do it. In other countries, I shouldn't say certain ones because I can't remember which cultures, they actually prefer chicory to coffee. It could also be blended with coffee in a, whatever ratio you take your fancy to. I found it interesting that it was the colonials who started using chicory in North America when there were coffee rations, and this was a way to still get that bitter drink beverage while still having to be limited by the coffee rations being, in North America during colonial times. This was far more readily available and far less expensive than importing coffee. So I thought that was kind of a neat, facto to share. I made the mistake of trying it too after I made it up, to not put sugar, not put any milk, and just drink it black. That was a bad idea. It didn't taste very good. Mind you, I also don't like my coffee black. So why am I comparing a coffee substitute when I'm not preparing it the same way as my coffee? So that's why I added a bit of sugar, and then I found it was rather palatable. But even still, I could not take a full mug of this. I had to drink it over the course of the day in small sips, mostly just because it was so bitter and I'm not accustomed to that kind of a palate. And apparently it's a rather trendy thing for people to be drinking. I didn't know that until I started looking it up. So if anybody else has come into this in a more modern ingredient, I guess we should say, or alternative to coffee, I'd be curious if anybody has actually bought some at a health food department store, because you can buy like a bag of it ground up and pre-made for you if you want to go that route, but I did not.
The petals ground with sugar is like an Elizabethan recipe. I believe it's either a candy or a medicinal, but it turns purple, like it's this crazy purple color. And the leaves
And
are
it's just
also
sugar.
edible. Just sugar. You take a mortar and pestle and the leaves, and you grind sugar and the leaves together, and it turns into a syrup that's jewel toned.
Well, now make a note for that for next year.
I
because
think you have to cut the white off the end of the petal, or like is bitter or something, but I might be wrong. That might be just roses. But yeah, you can grind it in a mortar and pestle with sugar, and it's very, very, very vivid. It tastes fine, but like I have no use for that kind of syrup in my regular adventures, but
yeah,
it was
that's
worth
fair.
trying.
All right, so that does conclude the presentation because the only other page left is sources because I tried to be good and remember where all of my pictures came from, and they're none of mine. So thank you everybody for joining. Does anybody have any closing comments or questions that they would like to put out there?
This was fantastic. A good overview. A lot of medieval plants. I don't know if that was your plan or not, but you definitely hit some medieval notes in there. Even though the point was Ontario today, but it was great. Thank you very much for the class. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then maybe people will feel more comfortable jumping in.
Sounds great. Thank you.